So this is a very simple thing, but this, I think, is life-changing if you want to embrace this. Let me just say it that way. This is about, I think that if you can be sure you're right, then you can do something that's really quite remarkable. You can, and I got this from Davy Crockett. This guy was a frontiersman in the U.S. West. In case you don't, Nico might not be familiar with. Neither of you might be familiar with him. He was a very popular folk hero about the time I was growing up, and Frank and I and everybody had a coonskin cap. But that time it wasn't him. It was popular to have a coonskin cap because it was an easy way to make a hat, and it was waterproof and warm. And this guy became a congressman. He was an explorer, notably exploring the West. And of course, the exploration of the West is sort of precious to me. I think going back to that time, even this was an interesting time in the country where we had lawlessness from the people who were part of the Civil War, and that was what these Western movies are about typically. And exploring. I mean, think about what that must have been like to have a whole part of the country that nobody knew what it was, and it was pretty well unexplored until gold was discovered in the West, and then people poured by the millions, I guess, and they walked across the U.S. I mean, think about this. They had these covered wagons, but they didn't ride in them. The wagons couldn't take the load of people, so they walked. And the biggest issue was the rivers and the mountains. How'd they ford the rivers? How'd they cross the mountains? And there were trails. And in this part of the country, up in Wyoming, you can go visit these, like the Oregon Trail, where they crossed the Platte River. And there were rocks, big rocks that were kind of monuments. And if you didn't leave that rock by a certain date, you didn't go because you couldn't cross the mountains in the snow. And people died doing this. And so this was a time of great mystery of what this land was like. And I like to tell, how do you know you're right? So I think the most important part of this is really being sure you're right. And how do you know this? I mean, at some level, we think we're right in whatever we happen to come up with, but how are you sure enough? And this is it's about how you reason. So this is a little joke to start this off about a cub reporter who wants to interview a businessman. And the reporter asks the businessman for interview. He doesn't have time. Finally, he agrees to do the interview. And the reporter says, okay, the guy says to the reporter, one question, that's it. All I got time, one question. So the reporter agrees, says, what's the secret to your success? He says, good decisions. Bye. Well, the reporter is frustrated, so he's wanting to know more. He badgers the businessman for about a year, and finally he says, okay, one more question. And the reporter says, how'd you learn to make good decisions? He says, bad decisions. And that's one way to do this, but that's not what we're talking about. And I think the first part of this is critically about how you reason. And we mostly reason with analogy. If you ever stop to think about this, when you decide something, how do you get there? And this is the most common thing. And it works when the analogy is apt, and it fails when the analogy is not. So someone might ask me, give me an example of a failed reasoning by analogy, and an easy example is the space shuttle. So you might know this history, but NASA abruptly canceled Apollo in 1971. They had 4 missions to go with hardware-built astronauts in training, and they decided to stop it. And when I was in NASA, the story was that Congress had done it, but I've learned more recently that the people at Houston stopped it. And the reason they stopped it was that every mission had what I'm going to call diving catches. Every mission had things You know, you all know, everybody knows the story of Apollo 13 with the explosion of this gas tank. But every mission has something like it. Apollo 11 was hit by lightning just after it cleared the launch pad. It had no power for several minutes. They all had something. So they said, you know, we got to stop doing this because every mission has what I call diving catches. And so as soon as we have a mission where we kill everyone, it's going to erase the whole program's accomplishments. So what to do? NASA, like any organization, wants to continue its existence. So the administrator at the time, a guy named Jim Fletcher, that I happened to have a pretty good friendship with later, went, I'm sure, to the two centers involved, Johnson and Marshall, the two human flight centers, and said, what do we do? And they said, we build a space shuttle with a booster, a big booster that goes to a space station. And the reason for that is that's what they knew how to do. Johnson built the Apollo module, Marshall built the Saturn V. All of their contractors did it in reality. They had a shuttle, and they went to Nixon with the shuttle and station idea. Nixon had his own problems, and he said, pick one or the other. So Fletcher sat there for a second probably and picked the shuttle. So now they got the shuttle. Now they got to have a reason for it. So they decided to make it a general purpose launcher to replace the rockets. And the storyline they bought into was the shuttle's going to be cheap access to space. And that's nonsense. I mean, this is typical of what's happening with the Republican Party or various politicians. They build a storyline that just doesn't make any sense and they stick to it. So now Fletcher goes back and says, we're going to build a shuttle. It's going to be cheap access to space. And like a lot of political storylines, it looks pretty. It's a neat thing. It looks like an airplane. It flies like an airplane, lands like an airplane. They said it's reusable like an airplane. So they said it's going to fly 50 times a year. And I was part of the payload community at the time. And we believed it. Everyone said it's going to fly 50 times a year. It's reusable. So we're imagining it's going to land on the ground, get the tank filled up and take off and go again. Well, turns out that the nature of the thing was completely ridiculous. It was a terrible launch vehicle because you got to carry 150,000 pounds of dead weight, the orbiter, to orbit along with your payload, which at Hubble was 24,000 pounds. It's a very small fraction of a regular rocket. The last stage is almost nothing. So it can only go to very low altitude. It's very expensive. The reusability turned out to be a joke. It took 6 months to reuse it, not like an airplane where you turn it around in an hour. So NASA stuck with that flawed storyline, the reasoning by analogy, for 40 years. So that's that story. The better way is reasoning by first principles. And the story here is that with first principles, that's a very, very accurate way of reasoning if you don't carry it too far. And even Einstein said everything should be made as simple as possible. First principles thinking is inherently simple, but not more so. So the way that gets carried away is you get like Musk that takes a political idea like free speech, makes it a first principle, and it becomes dogma. It becomes so crazy that he rationalizes hate speech. But the point is, once you think about how you're reasoning, these are 3 ways to do it, and you're clear on the fact, if you're reasoning by analogy, you're clear that the analogy is apt, which it wasn't with the space shuttle. With first principles, you're clear it's really a first principle, a physics law, for example, and you put on the hat. Once you're absolutely sure you're right, the hat becomes magical. And the magic is that you can take action. And the problem with most things is taking action. I've given advice to many people about this, that, and the other, including you two, whether it's buying gold or building power systems in South Africa, things I think are probably good things to do. And rarely does anybody do it. So the whole point here is, and I think this is really important, is if you're really clear you're right, and you looked at how you're reasoning and you're reasoning in the right way, then you can get the magic of the hat working for you and take action. So that's the main story here. Comments or thoughts about this?
Charlie, this is just a strategy of how to figure it out if you're right or not. And I can't think of a better way than to get external input,
Yeah, I think
to get
that,
information from outside. And that's the only way to figure it out. Have I thought of everything? Am I right? Etc.
yeah, I think that's a good point, that get criticism, um, share it with other people. I, I tend to go to first principles thinking and have confidence in that. But, you know, I, for a blue, I think we tend to trust the logic more. But for most people, it's probably better to tell somebody else and say, have I got it right? And you need somebody you have to be willing to accept criticism, and we can't all do that. But that's really a good,
By
Nico.
by the way, I'll give you guys feedback, but I've just been invited into a course at the University of Malta, and it's all about at the Edward de Bono Institute, and it's all about out of the box thinking toolkit. So my intention is to apply that, and with the Nelsons in South Africa, to enhance that kind of thinking, out of the box thinking, because he labeled basically that phrase.
I think that another way to think about that is analogy is in the box thinking, because what you're depending on is past events. First principles thinking, I think almost by definition, is out of the box because you're freeing yourself up from history. There's no, and first principles thinking, unless you carry it too far, like I think Musk does, you can't, that will take you out of the box. That that's basically the idea of physics. And as I hate to keep citing Musk, but physics is the law, everything else is a recommendation. If you go to the limit of physics, physical law, that is out of the box because the box is the physical law.
Yeah, should be boundaries. I mean, out of the box in itself can't be right, because you
Yeah,
can
that's
be
right.
wrong out of the
That's right.
box as well, and
That's right.
crazy.
Exactly.
So you have to obviously just think
Well,
in a
I,
different way, like Einstein said, but
yeah,
then also weigh it up against all
I
the
don't,
logic
I,
stuff.
yeah, very good. The point here, I think, is that if you take, if you realize with certainty that you're right, then the the saying, then go ahead, is the magic hat. You then can take action. So um, this is how I think this is the secret of everything I've ever done, is this basic simple idea. Doing things that were contrary to what other people thought you should do or wanted you to do. And the way you get there is you make sure you got to be certain in your logic. And
Mm,
if you get to that point, then it's
mm.
easy to take action. I'm I'm
Well,
I'm I'm certain that my best preservation of wealth is buying physical gold. I'm certain of that, so I do it. I talked to other people about this, and they listen to the argument, and they often agree, but they don't take action because they haven't gotten to certainty about it. It takes
yeah,
it takes a lot of time and research to think about it, and I really think that this is a very, very powerful life thought, that if you can be certain
yeah,
that you've put
yeah,
the
yeah.
work into it, done the work, then you can take action. And
What you've said in the beginning, if you really take this and make this your own, be sure you're right. Simple as
mhm.
it is. But if you really do that, you will always have a story to tell as well. And I really think about my, whatever you want to call it, insight, moment of awareness, insight. But, that's really realization of where I was in 93, positioned with the apartheid system. And then I took my time and I got to that insight, and that obviously have had a lot of consequences, as you know.
So early on, you were bought into apartheid, you agreed with it?
Well, we were raised in that whole
Yeah,
thinking paradigm, you
yeah,
know.
when I was at Harvard, there was a Afrikaner in the class, and he argued the case for apartheid, and
Yeah,
everybody attacked him. And he was absolutely certain in his belief that was like a good and noble thing. And
yeah,
and I think the same thing with racism in the southern US.
exactly.
It wasn't seen as an evil thing. It wasn't seen as bad. It was just how life ought to be.
I'll never forget when I was there in 20, you know, with the George Floyd incident, and how many conversations I had with American people saying that now I see something for the first time. You know, I've never realized it was like this.
Wow, interesting. Welcome, Doreen.
Racism. Yeah, it
So
was very interesting. Hi, Dorinka.
Larissa was with us a few minutes ago. Her ship sailed, it looks like. She was on a boat. So
Yeah,
I don't know where she went, but we decided to go over this briefing I'm going to give in April in Severn. And I'm talking about the power of this thought to be certain you're right. And how do you know how can you be certain you're right? And Nico's making the point that it's good to get feedback from other people. And I'm talking about the fact that examining how you're reasoning is the point I'm trying to teach with this. And if you examine your reasoning carefully and you're sure of it, then the coonskin cap gets this magic of action. So I'm talking about the coonskin cap as a metaphor here. So if you and the key idea here is that if you have the certainty that you're right, then you have the ability to move to action. And I think that Peter Drucker's little saying here is important. It's not the absence of knowing what to do, the absence of doing it. So how do you move to action? So I was talking about the fact that I give people lots of advice. Maybe they don't want it, I don't know, and they generally agree with it, but they seldom do anything with it. Example would be my neighbor who we've been telling for 15 years he ought to buy a generator, and they agree but don't do anything. So I think this is exactly the whole point of this whole story. How do you move to action? And this little statement is how I did it. Be certain you're clear about your right, and then you can take action. Then the hat becomes magical with this little saying, and you take action. That's what we're talking about. So how do you decide if you're going to turn around and go swimming? Well, you're going to be sure it's the right thing to do, then go jump in the water behind you. This is the old stuff. We've been over this a lot. This is it's another really potent idea that what does it mean to be deceased? And I have lots of people who remain alive for me, and I still can hear them, things they've said. This is about this young man that died from a deer jumping in front of a car he's riding in, and the idea that I can imagine listening to him. So the idea that death of your body is not as important as death of your memory. If you're remembered by people, then you remain alive, and maybe the most important way. Thoughts or comments on this? This is another big, powerful idea, in my opinion. I have lots of friends that were influential, and I still think about them. And many of them I would very seldom interact with them in physical reality. They didn't live near me. Uh, So the fact that they're deceased is important in the sense that I regret that I'll never have another experience of them directly. However, I didn't have much of an experience with them anyway because they weren't near me. Typically in the US, people tend to move away, live far apart. So the idea that people remain alive in our minds, um, actually, I think that was what Christ's message was about this stuff, not your corporal body. The big idea. Comments, thoughts?
I'm good.
Then reasoning by analogy, it's how engineers work. It's how you follow recipes. It's technical charting. Most financial stuff that I watch, macro work, is technical charting, and it works if the analogy is apt. For engineers, it's fine if the new bridge you're building like the old one's close enough. For cooking, it's fine if the recipe is a really good one. For technical analysis, it's great if the situation is repetitive. And then first principles thinking, which goes back to Aristotle and how physicists work. And this is an opportunity for a little humor. The difference between scientists and engineers. Scientists love surprises, engineers hate them. And chefs that create the recipes, that they know the properties of these foods, and they know how to combine them with chopping and spicing and heating. And macro analysis, which does a similar financial estimating with macro data like the money supply, the interest rate curve inverting or not, this kind of thing. And I think overdone, it can morph into dogma. That's the danger here. So each has its strengths and each has its dangers, the two ways to think. And I think what's important is to know what you're using and know if you're reasoning by analogy, to know you're doing that, then ask yourself, is the analogy apt? And if it's first principles, is it really a first principle? And physics, the entirety of physics is the first principles of nature as confirmed by experiment. That's all physicists do. And it's interesting that physicists made the error of reasoning by analogy. For centuries, they believed, for example, that light traveled on ether because sound traveled on air. And in I think 1875 or so, two physicists made an experiment that was done so carefully to measure the rate at which the ether was moving. They thought that there must be a wind, like the wind blows the air around. And they did this experiment so carefully that it was indisputable. They showed there is no ether, and that changed everything. That led to conclusions like the fact that if there was no ether, logically, the speed of light is a constant in vacuum. And Einstein took that, and from that, he developed special relativity by just thinking. That's the first principles process. And that's absolutely correct. It's unassailable. There is no ether, and light travels independently through space completely differently than sound. So reasoning by analogy completely fails. And scientists looked at it that way for centuries. So I think Musk, an example of dogma is free speech is not a first principle. He treats it like it is, and therefore hate speech is acceptable. And he's wrong, in my opinion, about that. So you can go wrong with either way of reasoning, but I think the point is, if you want to set up to take action, the work you have to do is look at how you're reasoning, And most commonly, automatically, we reason by analogy. We don't think about it, but that's probably 98% of the thinking that you do is reasoning by analogy. So pay attention to it, and if you get clear that your reasoning is correct, that gives you the energy to move to action. But the prelude is you got to do the work of the reasoning. Okay on this?
Yep.
It makes sense?
Yep.
Yes, it does.
So then an example, we lived on Okinawa for almost 5 years. In fact, my entire youth was spent there. There was a friend of mine up here yesterday who was an electrical engineer, and he's talking about all the cool things he did, and I kept explaining I couldn't do that. The resource I had available was what's in the base exchange. That's the only store in town, and the whole time we were there, we were living in a wonderful setting that I certainly didn't realize. I don't think anybody did, and we yearned to be stateside because I think the access to society was so small. There was one store, and the store stocked what the military wanted to stock. It wasn't a hardship; it was a blissful life, but we didn't know it. So we yearned to be stateside, I think, the whole time, and have all the accoutrements of a larger society. We were back 1 hour and realized a terrible mistake. And my parents, especially my mother, had a really hard time adjusting because our standard of living went down enormously. On Okinawa, we had live-in servants. We had a house that was probably cheap or free. The officers' club, swimming pool, everything was cheap. I rode my bicycle to the movie theater if I wanted. It probably was 5 cents to watch a movie because it's all subsidized for the soldiers. And then I moved into a situation where the schools were being forcibly desegregated. There's a lot of talk these days about the Trump administration refusing to obey the courts, but it's happened before. The Supreme Court desegregated schools, and the Southern schools refused to do it. Ended up bringing soldiers into the streets of the U.S. soldiers to enforce the desegregation. That made a hostile thing at school. So the solution was to go away to school, and I had a grandfather willing to fund this. And he and my father and I came up with the idea of going to a military school. And at first I really liked it. And just thinking back on this now, it was like back on a military base. On the military base, everything is highly regulated. There is no theft. There is no bullying. There's no misbehavior. The speed limit is what it is, and you could leave a bicycle parked in a space with no lock. Nobody would steal it. And so the military school, just looking at it back, was a similar thing. And at the time, I had a good friend whose father was a teacher at a private school called Severn. And I got to know the father quite well. He was a retired Marine general, a really nice man, and got to be familiar with the school and decided that Severn was a much better choice. So I told my father I wanted to go to Severn. There's an animation problem here. I'm not going back to military school. He said, yes, you are. And his logic was, I want to see you graduate from there. So how is that? What kind of reasoning is that? That's reasoning by analogy, isn't it? This is what you're supposed to do. So I couldn't name it as such. And also, how much power did I have? Not much, right? My father paid the bills. I'm in high school. I had a business. I had a crabbing business. I had a license, crabbing license, but even that was dependent on him because he bought the gas for the boat. So, and this idea about power struggles, Could I win a power struggle with my father? Don't think so. So again, he was reasoning by analogy. So I recognize my life was shaped enormously by the Cold War. That's the biggest dominant influence there. At that time, the U.S. was terrified. We had a satellite from a hostile party over our head beeping radio signals. This was something that no one could conceive of. And I'm not making this up. And in high school in Annapolis, we practiced getting under our desks because we get attacked by a nuclear bomb. It was popular to build fallout shelters in your backyard. This was what the climate was like. And I think that just early on, to me, a technical degree was a matter of duty. I look back on that time and think that if you were able to do science and math, it was a matter of it was a duty to do it. We were in a war with the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev was banging his shoe with the UN and saying, we're going to bury you. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis, all this stuff. So I never thought I had a choice. I could do science, and therefore I must. So, and for me, what would be the best preparation? And Severin, I thought, was a better education. Plus, I had much more time flexibility than I had at the military school. Military school, you studied exactly 2 hours a day. That was it, 8 to 10 every day. That was study hall with a 10-minute break in the middle. So at Severin, I could study as I wanted, and I had free time. So how did I light up the decision to challenge my father? I didn't fight with him. I thought this is the right answer, so I took action and asked General Hummel to get me enrolled in Severin, and he did, and that was kind of a miracle in itself. Usually, Severin even has a grade school, and I think I was the only person to maybe ever go there just for 1 year. And he liked me. He went to bat. Told my father I was going. By the way, I was looking today. Get this: it costs $30,000 to go to Severin these days. Can you believe this? Back then, I don't think it was a financial burden at all. Much cheaper than military school. And after he got over being annoyed with me, he said to me, "One thing I admire about you, you always know what you want." And I think that's because I've had this capacity to reason. And Severin turned out to be great. Interestingly enough, it was a genteel place. My colleagues, even though I was only there as an outsider, were very friendly to me. It was just it was like a British. The school was named for a river in England, and I think it was like a British environment. And we had the main social event was lunchtime. We had, I think, an hour, and we played bridge. This is so odd for a high school.
Yeah, comment there.
Yeah,
That comment from your father, I mean, we often speak about appreciation, but that comment, I admire you, for me is nothing else than appreciation. And I think it probably had a huge impact in terms of self-belief as well.
yeah,
If we can get that kind of feedback to young people.
yeah. My father was probably the most positive influence in my life, much more so than my mother. So I appreciate him the more I think about him. And I had the chemistry class taught by a guy named Commander Seeger. He would jump up on top of the desk when he wanted to make a point. Can you imagine what that would do to high school kids, seeing your teacher jump up on top of their desk? He'd stand on the desk when he wanted to make a point. And I was admitted to a good university. I was ever taking the SAT. It was very unusual. They interviewed me, and I think it was the reputation of Severin my grades were good, but I wasn't, I was probably in the top, 20% of the class, but not near the top. A's and B's totally, but some B grades for sure. And when I went to Drexel, this is typical, I think, of technical schools. Half the students flunked out the first year. And the reason is that college level math and science is tough. These days, I think high schools are more advanced. They have more of these AP courses, this kind of thing. That wasn't common when I was there. But I think when people get into calculus and the more difficult technical courses, and chemistry was the hardest. Chemistry was the thing that they flunked out people with, the chemistry class. So I had this teacher that was jumped on top of the desk, was really good. And I went to the chemistry department and said, I don't need to take this class. And they laughed at me. They thought I was trying to avoid the class that everybody flunked out from. That's what they thought I was trying to do. And they laughed at me. They said, you're joking, right? I said, give me a test. And they did, a 2-hour test. They came back and said, you're right. You don't have to take college chemistry. That's how good this school was. So now I'm at Drexel and I'm graduating in physics. And I don't think I ever had a friendly relationship with a PhD of any kind. They weren't in my parents' social strata. And so about my junior year, I realized I had to go to graduate school. Physics is not optional. Engineering, people mostly went right to work with a bachelor's degree and maybe got a master's. But physics, I figured out if you don't have a PhD, you're nobody. You're going to be, almost can't get a job. So I got the idea to go back to southern Louisiana, where I'm from. So I applied to Tulane University, got accepted. Then out of the blue, my father calls me up, and there's a guy at NASA interested in talking to me, and it's the Sounding Rocket Division. And I talked to him. I never met the guy in person. I talked to him on the phone. He offered me a job. And I told him about graduate school. He said, Goddard had a program called 3-quarter where you could go to graduate school and get 2 days a week off while school's in session. And they pay the tuition. And also the salary of the job I was to take on was they had magnetometers that cost $8,000 and they're flying 80 flights a year. It's too much money. So at 23 years old, I had to agree to take on an assignment to solve this problem. And by analogy, I'd go to Tulane, I thought. You spent 5 years preparing for graduate school. Other physics majors, I didn't talk to them much about this, but I think most of them were going to graduate school somewhere. It's kind of what you're supposed to do. And if I went with NASA, I might not get enrolled in this program. I don't know that for sure. I might never be a PhD physicist. So it's time to start thinking about first principles. And for me, as I thought about it, advanced degrees were not an end, but a means. So I did not want a PhD in physics to have a PhD in physics. What I wanted was an intellectually stimulating career that contributed to society. And I think maybe the most important mindset that you can have is that you want to make a contribution. If that's how you think about things, you'll have successful marriage, successful relationships. And the Apollo program, to work on Apollo compared to being in the Defense Department, which is where I was as a student working, was just incredibly appealing. So moreover, I preferred when I went to undergraduate school, I went on a co-op program where I'm going to, the middle 3 years, I'm working 6 months a year and going to school 6 months a year. I liked working. And I think the reason was in school, especially physics, you're studying every night. I like to party and drink and play or play pool or whatever. And when I'm working, I got nights free. And the At that time, my government salary would be $7,000 a year versus 1,500 for a graduate student. In today's money, that's 65,000 versus 14,000. So I was tired of being poor. So I'm clear about what I want, first principles thinking. I go to NASA and ended up getting into the physics department at Catholic University. And the big benefit of that, so the first thing I did, I went to the library. There was no internet. I'm still using a slide rule for the next 7 years. There was no calculator. There's no computers. So I go to the library and go through books and indices about all the ways you can measure magnetic fields. I call it cast the net broadly. Ended up with the idea of a magnetometer called a flux gate. And thinking about it, I got the idea of a little ceramic core that you could put a drive current on, and you could put, actually, I realized you could put orthogonal sense windings and have a 2-axis magnetometer. And I built a prototype of this, and I had someone manufacture the cores for me for $100 a piece. And the rest of the magnetometer was less than 100, so I had a $200 magnetometer. And an Argentinian engineer joined me. And he said, "You're not an electrical engineer, are you?" I said, "No, I'm a physicist." He said, "Those things are ring cores. They're commonly used as transformers and circuits. You can buy it from a catalog for 50 cents. So sure enough, I went through a catalog and found one with the properties I wanted. And now we've got a whole magnetometer that I built. I contracted with them. So the trick in doing this is these windings have to be done very carefully. These have to be lined up very nicely. So I thought about this and I thought, who can do this? And I thought, women that do crocheting and this kind of thing, they have this manual dexterity. So I went out into the countryside and found a little company in the rural Virginia and said, "Can you find some ladies to come in and lay these windings like this?" He said, "Absolutely." So I contracted with them to buy 100 magnetometers for $100 a piece. And I built a computer model of this using a language called A programming language, which Bell Labs invented. It's an interpreter language. And I modeled this magnetometer and I changed all the parameters, the drive power, the material, number of windings, and optimized the design, published in IEEE. And unbeknownst to me, I got submitted for an award for a patent saving money. So we're buying 100 of these a year for $100, and instead of 100 of them for $8,000. So I got the largest patent award they'd ever given for this. And I'm 26 years old. And 3 years later, I managed to finish the comprehensive exams and decided to go shopping. My plan from the very get-go was to do a thesis at Goddard. Knew they had a very strong science staff. So all this comes from how you think about things. That's the message. We're at 9:59, so
No.
closing thoughts, anybody on this? This makes sense?
Well, that guy that had the interview with you on the telephone, you know, I think he should get an award, or we probably also got an award for that appointment because he really made a good choice. If you look at the outcome.
I didn't realize I'd never met him until I thought about the fact that when I went there, I was surprised that they weren't in the main building at Goddard. I went and checked in at the main Goddard facility, which is these very nice buildings. They said, "You're working in a warehouse in Belfast." And the fact that I didn't know that said, I never met the man. I just talked on the phone.
Thank you, Charlie. I am enjoying it every time that I hear the story. I know it very well, but every time I hear your talk, I learn something new. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I would like to say my apologies. I have a virtual office hours all today, and my students are in and out. So whenever students are in my Zoom room, I had to disconnect. I
I
apologize.
saw your ship sailed, Larissa. I said, Larissa took off in that boat and went someplace.
It's my job. When students are showing up in my virtual office, I have to help them. So
Well, when I was at CU, the only thing legally I was required to do is have student hours. That was the only legal requirement. And so when they came, I did exactly what you did. I dropped everything, gave them my full attention, whatever
yeah,
that was by law
yeah.
and by willingness too.
Yeah, same with me, Charlie. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to help my students. And at the same time, it's just sorry that I missed some parts of your talk, but I enjoyed it every time. Thank you very much. And I apologize to Darinka and to Nico for any interruptions that might cause.
Rick, any thoughts about this?
No, not at all.
Thank you. Thank you. My apologies for being late, but I at least I made it through half. And Charlie, it's really amazing. It's an amazing story about how to talk about career and how to set sail in life. It's how do you make those personal decisions. So thank you. It's really amazing to hear that.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good day, all.
Enjoy.
see you
I'll
next
see you
Bye-bye.
next week, and then I'm gone for almost a month.
Okay.
When is that?
I'm leaving the Saturday the 22nd. So we have
Saturday the 22nd.
one more session, and then I'm gone from the 22nd to March 17th,
Oh, wow.
almost a month.
Hope you will take some pictures and share it when you will be back.
I'll take a bazillion.
Okay.
Yeah.
I might even- I might
Talk
even
on
buy
Saturday.
a new camera I don't need while on this trip, because in Japan, the things come out a year earlier than you get the same products in the US.
Oh, wow.
Like the
Fantastic.
Advanced technology, maybe a mirrorless SLR, which is the latest thing. I don't know.
Charlie, it's on my bucket list to visit Japan. So when I will finally be packing my bags, I will call you for advice.
Well, Larissa, you gotta think about how you reasoned about that decision. And once you get clear, you'll be going, okay?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you all
Thanks,
for all best
See you
wishes.
next
See you next
week.
time.
Okay. Bye bye.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Bye.